never thought I'd question the bond with someone I trusted deeply until I pushed open the bathroom door that night. The steam curled out, but it wasn't just a shower, it was the start of something I'd never forget. What I saw shattered the thin layer of normalcy we clung to, and now, I can't unsee it. That one moment changed everything between us forever. Our home was a picture of quiet, predictable harmony, at least, it used to be. I married Mark 5 years ago, blending our lives and our families. My stepson, Chris, was 21, a reserved and responsible young man who had just moved back in with us temporarily while his college dorm underwent renovations. Chris wasn't the kind to draw attention to himself. He spent most of his time in his room or out with friends, a typical young adult navigating his independence. Despite his quiet nature, he was polite and thoughtful, always helping out when he could. I considered him a good kid, someone I could trust. Our interactions were casual yet cordial, marked by occasional shared meals and small talk about his classes or interests. For me, life was settled, almost routine. Mornings were spent rushing through coffee and emails, afternoons consumed by work, and evenings dedicated to family time. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady, and that stability was something I valued deeply. My marriage with Mark was solid, built on mutual respect and understanding. Or so I believed. Chris moving back home added a subtle shift to the household dynamic, but nothing felt out of place. If anything, I welcomed the chance to reconnect with him, to bridge the distance that naturally came with him growing older and more independent. I even appreciated the chance to mother him in small ways again, making his favorite meals or folding his laundry, little gestures that brought a sense of purpose. But beneath this surface of normalcy, there were cracks I hadn't noticed. Moments where my intuition tugged at me, though I dismissed them as paranoia. It was the little things, a slight tension in conversations, his unusually quiet demeanor during dinner, or the way he seemed to avoid eye contact more often than before. I attributed it to his age, the pressures of college, or simply his personality. I couldn't know, that one fleeting, unintentional moment would rip open those cracks, exposing emotions and tensions I wasn't prepared to face. In that split second, everything I thought I knew about my family, my role, and even myself, began to unravel. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a fleeting discomfort I couldn't quite shake. After that night by the bathroom door, everything felt different, off-kilter in a way I couldn't fully explain. I told myself it was nothing, just an awkward moment that would pass, but the unease lingered, growing heavier with each passing day. Chris, once so reserved, now seemed both closer and more distant at the same time. He was polite as always, but there was an undercurrent to our interactions that hadn't been there before. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long when he thought I wasn't looking. The awkward pauses in our conversations that used to flow so naturally. And then there were the silences, not peaceful or companionable, but charged and uneasy, like both of us were avoiding something we couldn't put into words. I started to notice things I hadn't before. He began keeping his phone close, glancing at it more often, as if he were waiting for a message he didn't want me to see. He'd disappear into his room for hours, the faint sound of music or video games leaking out, but when I'd pass by his door, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hyper-aware of my presence. It wasn't just his behavior that unsettled me, it was my own reactions. I found myself second-guessing everything, overanalyzing every interaction, every glance, every word exchanged. Was I imagining the tension, or was it real? And if it was real, what did it mean? My thoughts spiraled in ways I didn't like, making me question my own instincts and judgment. I hated how my mind kept circling back to that moment, replaying it like a broken record. Then there were the nights. Lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts raced uncontrollably. Every creak of the floorboards or muffled sound from Chris's room felt amplified, like a drumbeat echoing my own doubts. Mark, oblivious to the turmoil beneath the surface, slept soundly beside me, his breathing steady and unbothered. I envied his peace. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was all in my head, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something between Chris and me now, something unspoken but palpable, and I didn't know how to address it or if I even should. Every interaction felt like walking on a tightrope, careful not to fall into a chasm I couldn't climb out of. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room folding laundry, Chris entered, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said casually, his tone light but his posture stiff. "Need help with that?" I hesitated. "Sure," I replied, handing him a stack of clothes. We worked in silence, the television murmuring in the background. But I could feel his eyes on me, and when I glanced up, he quickly looked away. It was such a small thing, but it made my stomach twist. Was he feeling the same unease I was? Did he notice the subtle shift in our dynamic, or was this just my imagination running wild? As the days passed, my questions grew louder. I started paying closer attention to the little details, the way he fidgeted with his hands when we talked, the way his voice softened when he addressed me. Was it guilt I saw in his eyes? Or something else entirely? I didn't have answers, only more questions, and the weight of them pressed down on me like a storm cloud that refused to break. Something had changed between us, that much I knew. What I didn't know was how far it would go, or if I even wanted to find out. As much as I tried to ignore it, the tension between Chris and me seemed to weave itself into the fabric of our daily lives. Every shared glance, every fleeting touch when passing a dish at dinner, every accidental brush of hands when handing over laundry, it all carried a weight I couldn't understand, much less explain. What troubled me most was how my thoughts, once so grounded and clear, now drifted into territories I didn't dare linger on. It wasn't just me. Chris seemed different too. He wasn't the same reserved young man I had grown accustomed to over the years. His demeanor had shifted, subtle, but undeniable. His usual aloofness had given way to a kind of nervous energy. He avoided me when he could, but when he couldn't, his presence felt charged, as though every interaction carried unspoken words neither of us could bring ourselves to say. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Chris walked into the kitchen. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I glanced up, startled by his offer. Sure. Can you chop these vegetables?" I replied, handing him a cutting board. He moved beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. The air between us felt heavy, and I tried to focus on the task at hand. But when his hand accidentally grazed mine as he reached for a knife, a spark shot through me, a feeling so unexpected and foreign that I nearly dropped the spoon I was holding. "Sorry," he muttered, pulling his hand back quickly, his cheeks flushing. "It's fine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We worked in silence, the tension thick enough to cut with the knife he was holding. Every now and then, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye, noticing the way his jaw tightened or how his lips pressed into a thin line as if he was trying to keep something inside. I told myself it was nothing, just the awkwardness of our recent interactions, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Later that evening, as we sat together in the living room for family movie night, the atmosphere felt strained. Mark was engrossed in the film, laughing at the comedic moments, while Chris and I sat stiffly, a palpable distance between us despite our physical proximity. At one point, Chris's arm brushed against mine as he adjusted his position on the couch. The touch was innocent enough, but the way my heart raced told me otherwise. I needed space, a reprieve from the constant tension that had seeped into every corner of our lives. But every time I tried to create distance, it seemed to pull us closer. There was a moment, a fleeting one, that left me breathless and questioning everything. I was in the hallway, sorting through the mail, when Chris stepped out of his room. Our eyes met, and for a second, it felt as though the world around us blurred. Neither of us spoke, but the silence between us said more than words ever could. That night, I lay awake, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I hated how my thoughts had taken a turn I couldn't control, how I found myself analyzing every interaction, every glance, every word exchanged. It was as though I was watching myself from the outside, unable to stop the tide of emotions that had started to rise. What was happening to me? To us? And why couldn't I just let it go? The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. Chris seemed to linger in the same spaces as me more often, whether intentionally or not, I couldn't tell. But every encounter felt like a test, a line we were both dangerously close to crossing. I found myself second-guessing my own actions, questioning whether I was imagining the way his gaze lingered a moment too long or the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. One afternoon, as I was cleaning up after lunch, Chris walked into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, watching me as I wiped down the table. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone genuine, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, but his gaze didn't waver. "You just seem different lately." His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. I looked away, focusing on the plate in my hands. "It's nothing," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just a lot on my mind." "Me too," he replied, his voice quiet but filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. In that moment, I felt a crack in the wall I had been trying so hard to maintain. The unspoken tension between us was no longer something I could ignore. It was real, undeniable, and terrifying. And as I stood there, unable to meet his gaze, I knew that whatever was happening between us was no longer something I could brush aside. It was a force, pulling us closer to a precipice neither of us seemed willing or able to back away from. The night everything unraveled, the air was thick with tension. I had been trying to keep myself busy, cleaning up after dinner and avoiding the unspoken tension that had become a permanent fixture in our household. Mark had already gone to bed, leaving Chris and me alone in the quiet house. I could feel his presence even when he wasn't in the same room, a weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. Turning, I saw Chris standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. My heart skipped a beat. I nodded, unable to find my voice, and gestured for him to sit. He didn't. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on the floor. "There's something I need to say," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've been holding on to, and I can't keep it inside anymore." I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. "Chris, if this is about..." "It is," he interrupted, his eyes finally meeting mine. "That night. In the bathroom. I can't stop thinking about it." His words hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing everything around us. My chest tightened, my thoughts racing as I tried to process what he had just said. "Chris, that was a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "It was nothing. We both need to move past it." "But I can't," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've tried, but it's like it's stuck in my head. I keep replaying it, over and over, and it's driving me crazy." "Chris, please," I whispered, feeling the walls close in around me. "This isn't right. We can't." "I know it's not right," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "But that doesn't make it go away." We stood there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. I could see the torment in his eyes, the guilt and confusion that mirrored my own. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Not when I didn't believe it myself. Before I could say anything else, Chris took a step closer, closing the distance between us. His hand brushed against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. I pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest. "Chris, stop," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't what you think it is." "What if it is?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if this is real? What if..." "Don't," I cut him off, stepping back. "Don't say it. Don't even think it." He stared at me, his expression a mix of hurt and desperation. "Why are you so afraid to admit it?" he asked. "I can see it in your eyes. You feel it too." "I don't," I lied, shaking my head. "You're confused, Chris. We're both confused. This isn't real." His shoulders slumped, and he let out a shaky breath. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice hollow. "Maybe it's just me." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that if I denied it enough, it would go away. But the truth was, I felt it too, the pull, the connection, the overwhelming sense that something had changed between us. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it wouldn't disappear. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the tension, and we both turned to see Mark standing at the bottom step, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes shifting between Chris and me. Nothing, I said quickly, my voice steadier than I expected. Chris was just asking for advice about something. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press the issue. Well, it's late, he said. Maybe you two should call it a night. Chris nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor as he mumbled a good night and left the room. I stood there, my heart racing as Mark gave me a lingering look before heading back upstairs. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, and I knew that this was far from over. The following days were a blur of tension and avoidance. Chris kept his distance, barely speaking to me except for polite, surface-level interactions. Mark, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, carried on as if everything was normal. But I knew better. The cracks in our family were widening, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And then it happened. Late one evening, as I was sorting through laundry in my bedroom, Chris knocked on the door. His expression was serious, his eyes filled with determination. I can't do this anymore, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Chris, we've already talked about this, I said, my voice firm. We need to move past it. I tried, he said, his voice breaking. But it's not just about that night. It's about everything. The way I feel when I'm around you, the way I can't stop thinking about you. It's not going away. Chris, this is wrong, I said, my voice trembling. We can't. I know it's wrong, he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. But I can't help it. I'm sorry, but I can't pretend anymore. His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to cry, to tell him that he was being ridiculous, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. Before I could respond, the door opened, and Mark walked in, his expression one of confusion and concern. What's going on? He asked, his eyes shifting between Chris and me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to think of something to say. But the look on Chris's face said it all. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The room felt like it had been plunged into icy silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Mark stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed, trying to piece together what he had just walked into. Chris looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance, while I stood frozen, unable to find the words to explain what had just happened or to deny what it looked like. What's going on here? Mark asked, his voice sharper this time. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Chris, however, stepped forward. Nothing's going on, he said quickly, his tone calm but strained. I was just asking her for advice about something. Mark's eyes darted between us, his suspicion clear. At this hour? Behind a closed door? It's not what you think, I interjected, finally finding my voice. Chris was upset, and I was trying to help. That's all. Mark didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly. Fine, he said, his tone clipped. But this doesn't feel right. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I think we all need to take a step back. Chris nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. You're right. I'll head to bed. As Chris walked out of the room, I could feel Mark's eyes on me, heavy with doubt. Are you sure there's nothing going on? He asked softly. Of course, I said quickly, my voice trembling. It's just been tense lately. You know how things can get when we're all under one roof again. Mark seemed to accept my explanation, but the unease in his expression didn't fade. As he left the room, I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. The conversation with Chris, the look on Mark's face, the unbearable tension, it all felt like too much. The walls I had built to keep everything contained were beginning to crumble, and I didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was stifling. Mark seemed distracted, throwing himself into work, while Chris avoided me altogether, retreating to his room and only emerging for meals. I tried to act normal, but every interaction felt forced, every word tinged with an undercurrent of discomfort. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between us grew. Mark's suspicion lingered, though he never confronted me directly. Chris, on the other hand, became increasingly withdrawn. He started spending more time out of the house, and when he was home, he avoided being in the same room as me. The once familiar rhythm of our family life had been replaced with a strained, uneasy silence. I thought I could handle it, that the tension would eventually dissipate, but then came the breaking point. One evening, Chris didn't come home. Mark and I sat at the dinner table, the food growing cold as the hours ticked by. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. Mark grew increasingly agitated, pacing the living room and muttering under his breath. Finally, around midnight, Chris walked through the door, his face pale and his eyes red. "Where have you been?" Mark demanded, his voice echoing through the house. "Out," Chris said flatly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Out where?" Mark pressed, his frustration mounting. "You can't just disappear like that without telling anyone." "I needed space," Chris replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to think." Mark's anger simmered, but he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "Chris, we're all under a lot of stress right now, but this isn't helping." Chris nodded, but his expression didn't change. He glanced at me for a brief moment before heading upstairs, leaving Mark and me alone in the tense silence. "He's hiding something," Mark said finally, his voice heavy with suspicion. "And I think you know what it is." I looked at him, my stomach twisting into knots. "Mark, I promise, there's nothing going on. Chris is just struggling with something, and I'm trying to help." But the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. The cracks in our relationship were widening, and I didn't know how to stop it. The next day, Chris approached me while Mark was at work. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone hesitant. "Maybe it's time for me to move out." My heart sank. "Chris, you don't have to do that." "I do," he said firmly. "This isn't working. For any of us." I wanted to argue, to tell him that we could figure it out, but deep down, I knew he was right. His presence in the house had become a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong, and as much as it hurt to admit it, his leaving was the only way to move forward. That evening, Chris told Mark about his decision. Mark was surprised but didn't object, and within a week, Chris had packed his things and moved into a friend's apartment. The house felt emptier without him, but the tension that had suffocated us was finally gone. Mark and I tried to rebuild what had been broken, but the shadow of what had happened lingered. Trust, once so solid, now felt fragile. And though we never spoke of it again, the memory of those weeks hung between us like a ghost, a constant reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. With Chris gone, the house grew quiet, too quiet. The routines Mark and I had shared for years resumed, but they felt hollow, as though something essential was missing. The tension that had once filled every corner of our lives dissipated, but in its place lingered a profound sense of loss and unease. Mark tried to move forward. He poured himself into work, taking on extra projects and spending longer hours at the office. When he was home, he seemed preoccupied, distant in a way that left me questioning whether he was truly present. I tried to fill the gaps with my own routines, throwing myself into hobbies, volunteering, anything to distract myself from the gnawing sense of failure that shadowed my every step. Chris's departure left a void, not just in our home, but in me. I thought his absence would bring relief, but instead, it brought introspection. I replayed everything that had happened, scrutinizing every decision, every moment where I could have chosen differently. How had I let things spiral so far out of control? How had I allowed myself to become so blind to the consequences of my actions or inactions? In the weeks that followed, I sought answers, not just about Chris, but about myself. I began to see a therapist, hoping to untangle the web of guilt and confusion that had taken root in my mind. Through those sessions, I started to understand that what had happened wasn't just about one moment or one relationship, it was about the cracks that had been forming in my life long before Chris moved back home. I learned to confront my own vulnerabilities, to question the roles I had assigned myself and others in my life. I had been so focused on maintaining the image of a perfect family that I had ignored the subtle signs of disconnection, both with Mark and within myself. It was painful work, but necessary, and over time, I began to see a path forward. Chris and I didn't speak for months. The silence was heavy, but it felt like the right choice for both of us. Then, one day, I received a message from him. It was brief, just a simple acknowledgement of the time that had passed and a tentative hope to reconnect. "I'm sorry for everything," he wrote. "I hope you're doing okay." I didn't respond immediately. I stared at the message for what felt like hours, my heart torn between relief and apprehension. When I finally wrote back, my words were careful but honest. "I'm sorry too," I wrote. "I hope you're finding peace." We exchanged a few messages after that, each one tentative but meaningful. I didn't know if we would ever return to the relationship we had before, but I realized that wasn't the point. What mattered was that we were both trying, in our own ways, to heal. As for Mark and me, our marriage survived, but not without scars. We both agreed to see a counselor together, hoping to rebuild the trust and connection that had been fractured. It was slow work, filled with awkward conversations and painful truths, but it was worth it. Slowly, we began to find each other again, not as the people we used to be, but as the people we were becoming. Looking back, I realized that the real betrayal wasn't a single act or moment, it was the way I had allowed fear and avoidance to dictate my choices. I had betrayed myself by ignoring my own needs and emotions, and in doing so, I had let down the people I cared about most. If I've learned anything, it's that the strongest relationships are built on honesty, not just with others, but with yourself. The road to healing isn't easy, and it isn't quick, but it's worth it. Because in the end, the only way to truly move forward is to confront the truth, no matter how painful it may be. If you were in this situation, what would you have done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories that dive deep into the complexities of relationships and human emotions. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next story, it's one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty.